The rain in Manhattan did not fall. It drifted, a heavy metallic mist that lacquered the towering glass facade of the Vance Logistics World headquarters. On the 44th floor, the silence was expensive. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of a bespoke espresso machine and the faint, distant click of a fountain pen. Arthur Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a porcelain cup resting untouched in his hand. At 48, he possessed the quiet, immovable posture of a man who had built an empire from the back of a single rusted delivery van. His skin was the color of dark walnut. His hair cropped close and touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes, sharp, amber, and unreadable, carried the weight of 15 years of absolute corporate sovereignty. Vance Logistics was no longer just a company. It was the circulatory system of the Eastern Seaboard, moving $3 billion of freight every single day. Yet, looking down at the crawling yellow cabs below, Arthur felt a profound, suffocating detachment. "The quarterly culture audits are finalized, sir," his executive assistant, a polished young man named Julian, murmured from the mahogany doorway. Julian held a leather-bound tablet like a shield. "Employee satisfaction across the regional hubs is reported at an optimal 92%. Turnover remains remarkably low." Arthur did not turn around. He took a slow sip of the bitter black liquid in his cup. "Julian, have you ever looked at a spreadsheet of a forest while the trees were burning?" Julian blinked, his corporate smile faltering for a fraction of a second. I don't follow, sir. These numbers are polished by 3 different public relations firms before they hit my desk," Arthur said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded the room without effort. "They tell me what I want to hear. They tell me the machine is perfect. But yesterday, I took a walk through the Queens distribution terminal after midnight. The supervisors weren't managing. They were ruling. The laborers weren't working. They were surviving." He turned slowly, setting the porcelain cup on his glass desk with a deliberate click. "The corporate structure has become too thick, Julian. I am sitting on an invisible chair, floating above the reality of my own name. When the founder cannot feel the floor, the foundation begins to rot. Sir, if there are specific managerial issues—" "No," Arthur interrupted gently, raising a single calloused hand. "If I send an internal affairs team, the regional directors will stage a performance. I don't want a performance. I want the truth." Arthur walked over to the private wardrobe built into the office wall. He passed by the rows of tailored Tom Ford suits and reached into the far back, pulling out an off-the-rack charcoal gray polyester blazer he had purchased at a department store an hour prior. He stripped off his handmade Italian leather shoes, replacing them with a pair of scuffed, generic black Oxfords. From his desk drawer, he retrieved a manila folder containing a single printed document. It was a resume. The name at the top did not read Arthur Vance, Chairman and CEO. It read Artie Vance, high school graduate. 10 years of generic independent courier experience. References: none. "Sir," Julian gasped, his eyes widening as he realized what his boss was doing. "You can't be serious. You're going to infiltrate the lower tiers? If the board finds out, the stock margins, the board serves the margins." "I serve the company," Arthur said, adjusting the cheap, stiff lapels of the polyester jacket. He felt the uncomfortable restriction of the fabric and smiled. It felt real. It felt like the early days. "For the next 48 hours, Arthur Vance is on a sabbatical in Europe. If anyone calls the secure line, you handle it." He tucked the anonymous resume under his arm, walked past his stunned assistant, and stepped into the private executive elevator. As the doors slid shut, separating him from the luxury of the top floor, Arthur watched his reflection in the polished steel panel. The billionaire had vanished. In his place stood an aging, ordinary black applicant, heading down to the basement of his own empire to see if his dream still had a soul. The ground floor of the Vance Logistics Midtown distribution terminal did not possess the expensive silence of the executive suite. It smelled of industrial floor wax, damp cardboard, and anxiety. Rainwater dripped from the cheap umbrellas of 30 applicants crammed into a narrow corridor outside the regional human resources office. They sat on cold plastic chairs, clutching manila folders like lifelines, their eyes fixed on a frosted glass door that opened every 10 minutes to spit out a dejected, rejected soul. Arthur Vance sat at the very back of the queue, his broad shoulders slightly hunched to blend into the crowd. The cheap polyester jacket pinched under his arms, and his scuffed Oxfords were damp from the walk across the avenue. For 20 minutes, he had been observing the room with the clinical detachment of a scientist. What he saw troubled him deeply. The security guards at the front desk did not greet people. They barked orders. The administrative assistants handled the applicant's documents with a casual, trin-thwang carelessness that bordered on insult. The core values of dignity and respect that Arthur had personally written into the company charter 15 years ago had been completely erased, replaced by an iron-fisted corporate bureaucracy. "They aren't even looking at the qualifications," a soft voice whispered beside him. Arthur turned his head. Sitting on the plastic chair next to him was a young black man, no older than 24. He wore a crisp ironed white shirt and a tie that had seen better days, but his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. His folder contained a thick stack of certifications. "What makes you say that?" Arthur asked, his voice falling into a low, friendly tone that betrayed none of his executive authority. "I've been watching the people who go in," the young man said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "I'm Marcus, by the way. I've got a degree in global supply chains from QNY, plus 3 years managing a local warehouse in Brooklyn." "But the guy at the front desk?" "He saw my address and the color of my skin, and he put a black marker dot on the corner of my file before he even handed it to the interviewers inside." Arthur's amber eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "A black dot. A systemic screening method designed to categorize applicants based on neighborhood demographics and race, completely bypassing federal labor laws and company policy. That's a heavy accusation." "Marcus," Arthur said quietly, testing the young man's resolve. "It's not an accusation. It's just the tax we pay to get into the room," Marcus replied, keeping his voice down as an HR assistant glared at them. "The regional manager here, a guy named Henderson, only hires from his elite Ivy League network for upper tracks and uses people from our neighborhoods as disposable, low-wage temp labor. He calls it optimizing the human resource profile. I read it in his local business profile." Before Arthur could respond, the frosted glass door swung open with a violent click. A sharp, high-pitched voice echoed down the hallway. "Artie Vance. Room 104, now." Arthur stood up, smoothing the front of his cheap blazer. He looked down at Marcus and gave him a brief, firm nod. "Keep your chin up, Marcus. The structure might look solid, but sometimes it only takes one loose brick to bring down the whole wall." Arthur walked toward the door, his heart beating with a strange, long-forgotten adrenaline. He stepped inside room 104, leaving the billionaire behind, ready to meet the gatekeepers who had turned his empire into an elitist club. Room 104 was suffocatingly hot, smelling of stale coffee and expensive cologne. Sitting behind a sleek glass desk was Brad Henderson, the regional director of human resources. He was a man in his late 30s with a sharp, severely gelled haircut, clad in a crisp designer shirt with gold cufflinks. He did not look up when Arthur entered. He was too busy scrolling through his smartphone, his thumb flicking across the screen with absolute indifference. "Sit," Henderson muttered, gesturing vaguely toward a low, uncomfortable metal chair across from him. Arthur sat down, keeping his back straight. He placed his thin manila folder on the edge of the desk. Henderson finally dropped his phone, leaning back in his leather executive chair. He picked up Arthur's resume with 2 fingers, looking at it as if it were a contaminated biological sample. His eyes scanned the fabricated alias, Artie Vance, and the lackluster background of a local independent courier. "Artie," Henderson began, his tone dripping with a condescending, practiced pity. "Let's be real here. You're 48 years old. You have no corporate tenure, no advanced logistical certifications, and your last references are independent delivery clients from a decade ago. Why exactly are you applying for a logistics coordinator position at a multi-billion-dollar firm like Vance Logistics?" "Because I know how the freight moves, Mr. Henderson," Arthur replied calmly, his voice steady, devoid of the submissive tone Henderson was clearly expecting. "I've spent 20 years on the asphalt. I know that a 10-minute delay at a Queens checkpoint can cascade into a $30,000 penalty at the Manhattan terminal. I understand the geometry of the street. Henderson let out a sharp, mocking laugh, tossing the resume back onto the desk. The geometry of the street? Artie, this isn't the 1990s anymore. We don't rely on driver intuition. We use automated algorithms. We use hyper-predictive data streams. A guy with your profile isn't a coordinator. You're a component. You're a body we put behind a steering wheel when our automated systems experience a glitch. Arthur watched the man quietly. The arrogance was magnificent, a pure product of a corporate structure that protected managers from the consequences of their own ignorance. An algorithm cannot foresee a corrupt harbor master or a broken hydraulic lift on a loading dock, sir. Sometimes, human experience is the only thing that keeps the supply chain from breaking. Henderson's smile vanished, his face tightening at the subtle challenge to his authority. He leaned forward, tapping his gold pen against Arthur's folder. Let me tell you how this company actually works, Artie. I went to Wharton with the senior vice president of this division. We don't hire street experience for our management tracks. We hire pedigree. People like you are a dime a dozen. I could walk down to the lobby right now and replace you with 10 other guys who look exactly like you. And they wouldn't talk back. Henderson pulled a red stamp from his drawer, preparing to slam it down onto Arthur's file, the definitive mark of rejection. But before the ink could hit the paper, the intercom on his desk buzzed frantically. The voice of his chief secretary cut through the room, breathless and panicked. "Mr. Henderson! We have a Category 1 emergency at the Port Newark terminal. The central automated shipping manifest just crashed. 200 freightliners are locked at the gate, and New York Customs is threatening to levy a $500,000 fine every hour. The entire system is in a total gridlock." Brad Henderson's face drained of color so fast, it looked as if his expensive cologne was the only thing holding his expression together. He snatched up his smartphone, his fingers practically stabbing the glass screen as he muttered curses under his breath. The intercom continued to blare with frantic updates from the floor managers downstairs, a chorus of absolute chaos. "Sir, the drivers are threatening to strike if they miss their dispatch windows." The secretary's voice cried out. "The corporate hotline from Manhattan is ringing off the hook." Henderson looked down at Arthur, then over at the red rejection stamp still hovering in his hand. The sheer panic in his eyes was replaced by a sudden, predatory calculation. The regional office was desperately understaffed. The senior analysts were trapped in emergency Zoom meetings, and the logistics floor was turning into a war zone. He needed bodies to throw into the fire, disposable scapegoats to handle the furious truck drivers, while the executives tried to protect their own careers. Change of plans. "Artie!" Henderson snapped, slamming the red stamp back into his drawer. He reached into his cabinet and pulled out 2 generic, unassigned plastic temporary entry badges. "We're running a live operational crisis simulation. Consider this your extended interview. You and that kid you were talking to in the lobby, Marcus, are on the floor for a 48-hour trial. Starting right now." "And what exactly are our parameters, Mr. Henderson?" Arthur asked, his voice remaining utterly unshaken. "Your parameters are to get those angry drivers to shut up. Accept their manual manifests and keep the loading bays clear," Henderson sneered, tossing the temporary badges onto the desk. "You'll be working the midnight to noon shift under Assistant Director Vance's direct tracking system. If you lose a single container, or if a driver logs a formal union complaint against this terminal during your shift, you're both blacklisted from the entire industry. Let's see how long that street experience of yours lasts when the grid is burning." Arthur picked up the 2 badges from the desk. The plastic felt cheap, cold, and entirely devoid of the weight his actual executive credentials carried. He offered Henderson a slow, tight nod. "We'll take the shift." 10 minutes later, Arthur stood in the buzzing, neon-lit locker room of the lower terminal floor, handing the second temporary badge to Marcus. The young man looked bewildered, his fingers tightening around the lanyard as he stared at the flashing red alert monitors hanging from the ceiling. "They're throwing us straight into a meat grinder." "Artie," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a tense whisper as a crowd of exhausted warehouse workers rushed past them. "The automated mainframe is down. The senior dispatchers are hiding in their offices, and they just put 2 unranked rookies on the high-priority cargo lines. They want us to fail. If we screw up a manual manifest, Henderson will legally pin the customs fines on our personal records. Arthur adjusted the stiff collar of his department store blazer, his eyes fixed on the massive digital board tracking the locked containers at the port. For the first time in 15 years, he felt a genuine surge of competitive fire in his veins. Chapter 4. The 48-Hour Trial Brad. Henderson's face drained of color so fast it looked as if his expensive cologne was the only thing holding his expression together. He snatched up his smartphone, his fingers practically stabbing the glass screen as he muttered curses under his breath. The intercom continued to blare with frantic updates from the floor managers downstairs, a chorus of absolute chaos. "Sir, the drivers are threatening to strike if they miss their dispatch windows," the secretary's voice cried out. "The corporate hotline from Manhattan is ringing off the hook." Henderson looked down at Arthur, then over at the red rejection stamp still hovering in his hand. The sheer panic in his eyes was replaced by a sudden predatory calculation. The regional office was desperately understaffed. The senior analysts were trapped in emergency Zoom meetings, and the logistics floor was turning into a war zone. He needed bodies to throw into the fire, disposable scapegoats to handle the furious truck drivers, while the executives tried to protect their own careers. Change of plans. "Artie!" Henderson snapped, slamming the red stamp back into his drawer. He reached into his cabinet and pulled out 2 generic, unassigned plastic temporary entry badges. "We're running a live operational crisis simulation. Consider this your extended interview. You and that kid you were talking to in the lobby, Marcus, are on the floor for a 48-hour trial. Starting right now." "And what exactly are our parameters, Mr. Henderson?" Arthur asked, his voice remaining utterly unshaken. "Your parameters are to get those angry drivers to shut up. Accept their manual manifests and keep the loading bays clear," Henderson sneered, tossing the temporary badges onto the desk. "You'll be working the midnight to noon shift under Assistant Director Vance's direct tracking system. If you lose a single container, or if a driver logs a formal union complaint against this terminal during your shift, you're both blacklisted from the entire industry. Let's see how long that street experience of yours lasts when the grid is burning." Arthur picked up the 2 badges from the desk. The plastic felt cheap, cold, and entirely devoid of the weight his actual executive credentials carried. He offered Henderson a slow, tight nod. "We'll take the shift." 10 minutes later, Arthur stood in the buzzing, neon-lit locker room of the lower terminal floor, handing the second temporary badge to Marcus. The young man looked bewildered, his fingers tightening around the lanyard as he stared at the flashing red alert monitors hanging from the ceiling. "They're throwing us straight into a meat grinder." "Artie," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a tense whisper as a crowd of exhausted warehouse workers rushed past them. "The automated mainframe is down, the senior dispatchers are hiding in their offices, and they just put 2 unranked rookies on the high-priority cargo lines. They want us to fail. If we screw up a manual manifest, Henderson will legally pin the customs fines on our personal records." Arthur adjusted the stiff collar of his department store blazer, his eyes fixed on the massive digital board tracking the locked containers at the port. For the first time in 15 years, he felt a genuine surge of competitive fire in his veins. They want components they can blame. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that low, heavy resonance that had once commanded corporate boardrooms across the nation. But they forgot that a component is the only thing that actually keeps a machine moving. "Let's show them what happens when the foundation takes over the steering wheel." By 2 a.m., the Midtown terminal had descended into a corporate circles of hell. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, stale energy drinks, and pure panic. Outside the glass walls of the Central Operations bullpen, the headlights of over 100 massive semi-trucks formed a glaring, horn-honking sea of steel that stretched all the way back to the Lincoln Tunnel. The automated system failure had crippled the routing software. Without the digital manifests, the yard cranes didn't know which containers belonged to which chassis, and the terminal's main servers were throwing back nothing but a continuous stream of encrypted error codes. It's a total catastrophic cascade. A senior supervisor screamed into his headset, violently tearing it off his head and throwing it onto the desk. "The automated routing algorithm is completely dead. We can't verify the customs clearance for the pharmaceuticals or the high-priority microchip shipments from Europe. If those trucks don't move in 30 minutes, New York Customs is locking down the entire sector. Brad Henderson stood in the elevated glass VIP gallery overlooking the operations floor, his tailored shirt soaked in sweat as he watched the digital loss counter tick upward into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where are the manual fallback codes? Who has the physical master ledger? The ledger was phased out 5 years ago, Mr. Henderson. The supervisor yelled back, his voice cracking with terror. Everything is cloud-based now. We don't have a backup plan. In the middle of the screaming bullpen, surrounded by frantic analysts who were typing randomly on dead keyboards, Arthur Vance sat quietly at a low-end terminal desk in the rear corner. Beside him, Marcus was furiously flipping through old, printed shipping manifests, his eyes bloodshot behind his glasses as he tried to cross-reference the container numbers by hand. It's impossible. Artie! Marcus muttered, his hands shaking as he dropped the papers. The tracking numbers don't match the physical yard grid slots anymore. The software randomized the distribution before it crashed. We're flying completely blind. If we send the wrong truck to the wrong crane, it'll cause an industrial pileup that'll shut this port down for a month. Arthur looked at the flashing green cursor on his terminal monitor. He didn't look at the chaos, nor did he listen to the screaming supervisors. His mind had already shifted into a state of absolute, hyper-focused clarity, the legendary analytical mindset that had allowed him to build this entire logistics empire from a single, manual dispatch book in the 1990s. He knew every single line of code in the legacy framework of this company, because he had helped design it. He knew that beneath the modern, bloated, cloud-based interface that Henderson's Ivy League analysts relied upon, the old, indestructible Unix-based subterranean architecture of Vance Logistics was still humming silently in the dark. Marcus, Arthur said, his calm, steady baritone completely cutting through the young man's panic. Stop looking at the paper. Look at the physical weight of the trucks. What? Marcus blinked, completely caught off guard. The algorithms look at numbers, but the asphalt looks at weight, Arthur said, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the live video feed of the shipping yard. Look at the suspension on the trucks in lane 3. Those aren't agricultural goods. Those are heavy-density silicon wafers from Germany. The customs clearance code for that specific weight class isn't stored in the cloud mainframe. It's hard-coded into the terminal's local gate relays to prevent power grid overloads. Arthur reached out, his calloused hands hovering over the cheap keyboard. He didn't look like a nervous 48-year-old applicant anymore. His spine straightened, his posture radiating an untouchable absolute authority. With a series of rapid, rhythmic keystrokes that bypassed the modern Windows interface entirely, he brought up a stark, black-and-white command line prompt. Artie, what are you doing? Marcus whispered, his jaw dropping as he watched the terminal's security firewalls begin to ripple across the screen. That's a restricted internal directory. If security catches you executing a core command, they won't catch us, Arthur said quietly, his thumb striking the enter key with surgical precision. Because they don't even know this directory exists. The monochrome command line interface flickered on the monitor, casting a pale green glow over Arthur's face. To any passerby in the frantic bullpen, it looked like a broken system utility. But to Arthur, it was the digital skeleton of his empire. Type this exact syntax into your terminal, Marcus, Arthur instructed, his voice dropping into a low, unshakable cadence. Alpha Zulu 9er Echo. It bypasses the modern cloud layer completely and pings the primary underground mainframe. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening as he stared at his older counterpart. There was something terrifyingly commanding about Arthur's presence right now, the posture, the focus, the absolute lack of fear. Marcus swallowed hard, his fingers flying across his keyboard to mimic the command. Artie, how do you know these legacy access protocols? This stuff isn't in any of our training manuals. I spent a long time on the asphalt, Marcus, Arthur replied smoothly, his eyes never leaving the cascading lines of raw data. You learn to look at the bones of a building, not just the paint. With a final sharp stroke of the enter key, Arthur executed the bypass. Instantly, the flashing red warning screens across the entire Queen's distribution bullpen blinked out. replaced by a steady, calm blue interface. The automated hydraulic gates at Port Newark suddenly hissed to life, swinging wide open as the local relays recognized the hard-coded overrides. The yard cranes received their manual slotting coordinates directly onto their internal cabin screens, bypassing the broken scheduling software entirely. The Lane 3 trucks are moving. A technician screamed from the front of the room, pointing frantically at the live yard monitors. "The gridlock is clearing!" Who did that? Who injected the override patch? In the elevated VIP gallery, Brad Henderson let out a massive sigh of relief, leaning heavily against the glass railing as he wiped the cold sweat from his neck. He didn't know who had fixed the system, and frankly, he didn't care. The disaster had been averted, his career was safe, and the quarterly profit margins would remain intact. He looked down at the bullpen, his eyes scanning the sea of exhausted employees until they landed on the rear corner desk, where Arthur and Marcus sat quietly, their screens already cleared of the black and white terminal windows. A cold, opportunistic smirk slowly crept back onto Henderson's face. The crisis was over, which meant it was time to re-establish the corporate hierarchy. By 11:30 a.m., the 48-hour trial had officially concluded. The morning sun finally broke through the Manhattan mist, pouring bright, harsh light through the windows of the HR executive suite. The distribution terminal was operating at peak efficiency, the trucks flowing smoothly across the avenue like a perfectly synchronized watch. Arthur, Vance, and Marcus stood side by side in front of Brad Henderson's glass desk. Arthur's cheap department store blazer was wrinkled, his scuffed Oxfords covered in a thin layer of terminal dust, but he stood with his shoulders squared, his gaze completely steady. Marcus stood beside him, clutching his manila folder, his heart hammering against his ribs in anticipation. Henderson sat back in his leather chair, swirling a fresh cup of gourmet coffee. He looked at the two men, his expression a mask of supreme, condescending arrogance. "Well, Artie, Marcus," Henderson began, tossing their temporary plastic badges into the wastebasket beside his desk with a deliberate flick of his wrist. "The crisis was managed, and the terminal survived. I'll admit, you two managed to keep the loading bays from burning down during the night shift. But this is a multi-billion-dollar global corporation, not a local delivery service. The manual overrides we implemented saved this terminal $600,000 in customs penalties last night." "Mr. Henderson," Marcus spoke up, his voice trembling slightly but filled with a righteous determination. The data shows what I say it shows, Marcus," Henderson interrupted sharply, his voice dripping with venom as he leaned forward, tapping his gold fountain pen against the mahogany desk. "Let's be completely transparent here. You two executed an unauthorized system override on a restricted internal directory without managerial clearance. In the corporate world, that isn't called initiative. It's called a liability." He picked up their files, opening his drawer to retrieve the heavy red stamp. "You don't have the pedigree for this firm," Henderson sneered, looking directly at Arthur. "You're a 48-year-old courier with zero institutional value, Artie. And you, Marcus, are a liability who doesn't understand your place in the chain of command. I am officially logging a security violation against both of your profiles. You are denied employment, and you are barred from stepping foot on any Vance logistics property nationwide. Now, take your things and get out of my office before I have security throw you onto the street." Arthur did not flinch. He did not yell, nor did he beg. He simply looked at Henderson, a small, cold smile touching the corners of his lips. It was the exact look he gave competitors right before he bought them out. You should have checked the foundation before you tried to lock the door. "Brad," Arthur said quietly, his voice dropping into that deep, terrifyingly calm executive resonance. Henderson blinked, momentarily startled by the sudden shift in the older man's demeanor. "What did you just call me?" Before Henderson could finish his sentence, the heavy oak double doors of the HR suite were violently thrown open. A phalanx of 6 men and women dressed in flawless black bespoke tailored suits marched into the room, their expressions grim and professional. Leading the group was the Senior Vice President of Global Operations, followed closely by the head of Corporate Legal Counsel and Arthur's personal executive assistant, Julian, who carried a sleek, encrypted leather briefcase. Brad Henderson instantly scrambled out of his chair, his gold cufflinks clinking against the desk as he bowed his head with sycophantic panic. "Sir, Vice President Davis," I didn't know you were visiting the regional hub today. The Newark crisis has been completely resolved under my direct supervision, I assure you. SVP Davis didn't even look at Henderson. He marched straight past the glass desk, stopped precisely 2 feet in front of Arthur Vance, and bowed his head with absolute, unshakable reverence. We received the encrypted secure transmission from the legacy mainframe at 3 a.m. Sir, Davis said, his voice echoing through the silent room. The board of directors has been assembled on the secure line. We have been waiting for your final command. Julian stepped forward, opening the leather briefcase and retrieving a heavy, pristine platinum identification card embossed with the gold crest of the chairman of the board. He presented it to Arthur with a deep bow. Your sabbatical is officially over, Chairman Vance. Brad Henderson's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. The dark liquid splashed across his expensive leather shoes, but he didn't feel it. His knees began to shake, his face turning an ash-gray color as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible reality. The older, ordinary black applicant he had spent 2 days mocking, insulting, and trying to destroy was the billionaire founder who owned the entire empire. You, Henderson whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. You're Arthur Vance. Arthur calmly took the platinum chairman credentials from Julian, clipping them to the pocket of his cheap, wrinkled polyester blazer. The contrast was magnificent. The armor of a king worn over the uniform of a laborer. He turned his amber eyes toward Henderson, the gaze so sharp it felt like a physical weight in the room. 15 years ago, I built this company on a simple promise. Brad, Arthur said, walking slowly behind the glass desk. Taking Henderson's seat as the regional director backed into the corner in pure terror. That every driver, every dispatcher, and every laborer would be treated with absolute dignity. I came down here to see if that promise was still alive. Instead, I found you. Arthur picked up the red rejection stamp from the desk, looking at it calmly. You screen applicants by the color of their skin and their zip codes. You use corporate buzzwords to mask your own incompetence, and you sacrifice the very people who keep your machines moving to protect your own chair. You told me that people like us are a dime a dozen. But the truth is, Brad, people like you are the rot in the foundation. Arthur slammed the red stamp down onto Henderson's personal regional file with a thunderous thud. Brad Henderson. You are terminated from Vance Logistics effective immediately, Arthur announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. Your stock options are voided under the Corporate Integrity Clause, and our legal team will be reviewing your regional hiring practices for federal compliance. Security will escort you to the curb. Do not take your things. 2 heavy corporate guards instantly stepped into the room, grabbing the trembling regional director by his arms and dragging him out of the office as he began to weep, his designer suit disheveled. Arthur stood up from the leather chair, turning his attention to Marcus, who was still standing by the door, completely frozen in absolute shock. Marcus, Arthur said, his expression softening into a genuine, warm smile. Sir, Marcus stammered, his posture tightening. You have a brilliant mind for structure. Son, Arthur said, walking over and placing a heavy, proud hand on the young man's shoulder. And more importantly, you have the integrity to stand by the people on the asphalt. As of this moment, you are the new Director of Regional Operations for the Midtown Hub. Julian will handle your contract and your new equity package before the end of the day. Marcus looked at the platinum credentials on Arthur's chest, tears of pure relief and validation welling in his eyes. He managed a deep emotional nod. Thank you, Chairman. I won't let the foundation down. I know you won't. Arthur smiled. The billionaire founder walked out of the HR suite, leaving the cheap department store blazer behind, stepping into the private executive elevator alongside his lawyers. As the doors slid shut, looking out at the massive, smooth-flowing logistics yard below, Arthur Vance knew his empire finally had its soul back. The walk through the basement was over, and the master architect was returning to his throne.